My question is for Ming Tiampo. I'm curious about the red motif you have on the cover of the Présence Africaine, the red motif which is there. Can you please talk about it?
I think you're probably talking about the image that's on the front of the cover.
Yeah.
So it's a Dogon mask. And actually what's interesting about the fact that they have a Dogon image on the front cover is that it really points to the way in which Présence Africaine was at the intersection of sort of French anthropological fascination with Africa as a sort of primitivist gesture. Well, so there's the anthropologists, and then there's also the cubists and the surrealists who are very interested in Africa as a sort of idea. But then also the activists of Négritude. And there's this really uncomfortable kind of alliance that emerges between them that is not as black and white as one might imagine. It's actually quite a complex relationship. So for example, you know, in those of us who sort of think about critiques of Eurocentrism and the ways in which European art history is written, also, you know, a very easy critique that we make is about Picasso's primitivism. But what one learns over time is that actually Picasso drew the image, the front cover image, I showed it earlier, that was used for the first Congress of African writers and artists. And Sartre also participates in this movement, writing the preface for Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. So you see that there's this very, you know, complex relationship that develops between the European sort of world of anthropology and artistic practices and African resistance movements and solidarity movements. And the Dogon mask is really kind of a really interesting cipher of that because of the way in which it's embraced as a kind of you know, alternative modernism by both sides. That it's, you know, there's a sort of elegant abstraction about it that is very much loved by the European avant-garde, but also used as a central motif in Négritude.
Thank you, Ming. Other questions? I have a question for Atreyee. I was struck by the surrealist and occult strain in your reference, right? In your presentation, I was wondering how that relates to the materialist critique. Is there some kind of contradiction between the occult and the materialist? Or it's the binary opposition that like this Western model has assumed?
I think the surrealist strain was primarily coming from Octavio Paz, but it's not taken up by any of the Group 1890 artists or Swaminathan himself. In any kind of constitutive way. They are all, in some sense or the other, interested in materiality, but they're also interested in what they perceive as the non-modern strains within the tribal and the folk. So for them it's very much an act of really digging down and digging in and bringing a certain kind of understanding about matter that's vibrant, that's curative, that's cathartic, that can cure, but that can also afflict. So in this particular instance, it's a very shamanic relationship to matter. Paz was, of course, very ingrained within the surrealist discourse. So when the surrealist strain primarily comes via Paz.
Would anyone like to pick up on that, or other questions for the other panelists are welcome as well. Yeah. Yeah, Priya. Yeah, please. I don't think they can hear you. Yeah. Over there.
My question is for Atreyee. You use this phrase, the debris of industrialization, and you linked this with some of the slides which used industrial scrap to construct sculpture. Is it possible for you to shed light in terms of a comparative survey? Was this idea of mining industrial scrap to constitute the new modern being used elsewhere other than Group 1890 within India or South Asia?
For the most part, when several Indian artists start using scrap, but for the most, so when I say the debris of modernity, I'm specifically referring to the ways in which this scrap was collected. So very literally collected from flea markets or industrial excess from factories. Although there were several other artists who were working with welding and working with metal, and at face value the sculptures have a very similar visual effect. But these metals were not actually scrap metal. They were purchased as metal and then used as scrap, if that makes sense. In contrast, when I say debris of modernity, I'm specifically referring to an act of scavenging.
So there are two other contexts where I can think of this kind of use of scrap. One of them is the Gupta group in Japan, and actually both of the contexts that that I'm mentioning here, it's important to say that they're post-war. So, Japan after the war, there's quite, the material conditions of war still existed on some level. Although by 1955, 10 years later, they already had some rebuilding in infrastructure. However, nevertheless, the artists of the Gupta movement often used detritus in their work precisely to sort of embrace and articulate a new aesthetics of the post-war condition that really addressed the kind of material livelihoods that they were experiencing at that time. So there's an artist that does wood burning works, Yoshida Toshio, who also uses some of the same techniques that you were showing us. There's also the use of paper to make canvas that looks kind of, it's not that nice, and then it sort of falls apart when the artist Shimamoto Shozo draws it and creates these holes in the work. And then that sort of leads me to the other example, which is arte povera in Italy, and the use of sort of materials of poverty along the same vein in a post-war context.
And I have a question for Kristine and Saira. When you do, I'm interested in methodology. When you do the study of exhibitions, would you locate it in the context of a larger project? Like, is it art history? Is it a sociology of the art world? What is the larger picture of your efforts in terms of method?
So thank you for the question. That's one thing I didn't get to go into a bit. I sort of mentioned the sort of forensic work. The space in which this research project has been shown is through talks, sometimes in academic conferences, mostly in sort of contemporary art contexts. but the final form in which this project has taken place is an archival and documentary exhibition. So all this research, of which I've tried to skim through way too much in very little amount of time, has taken the form of an exhibition which has no original artwork. The exhibition is called Past is Quiet, Narratives and Ghosts from the International Art Exhibition for Palestine. And what happened, I think, with this research project when Rasha and I began, we started with a catalog for this exhibition in Beirut. And it took 2 years before we found a little bit of information. And the third year we met this French artist, Claude Lazare, who when we went to him, he said, I've been waiting for you for 30 years. And he had 3 boxes of material. And that's when it expanded beyond this one exhibition in Lebanon. It forced us to think about, it forced us to think beyond this one exhibition and to look at the networks of these practices. So our methodologies are various, sometimes questionable, sometimes, questionable in the sense that sometimes there's not stealing from people, but sort of reappropriating images from films within kind of the way that we present this material. So the exhibition Past is Quiet has no original artwork and no original archives and vitrines. So it's all reproductions of documents, images, and it really is a project to tell stories of a period, of a world that doesn't exist today anymore. Many of these artists are very famous, many of them are still not known. And the project tries to, through, in a way, reconstructing and reconstituting these networks through the research. In the case of Saira, in the case of Lebanon, there were no archives. There's no archive. All the archives were destroyed in 1982 for the history of this exhibition in Beirut. And so we had to go to people. We had to go talk to individuals about what they remembered about the show. When we asked people in Beirut about the exhibition, they said, oh yeah, like some people remembered it, some people really remembered it, many, and we had to go to the artists. We used this catalog as the evidence, and we went one by one, tried to find and meet as many artists as possible, and ask them what they remembered about the show. And many people said, oh, this is what we did. We gave artworks to causes. This is how we expressed our solidarity. Others traveled to Beirut and they were involved in the process. Others don't remember it all. And I think that thinking about memory and the violence of that period and how people remember things is really important to acknowledge the complexity of that and give them space for that and their generosity and time, but also at the same time is to completely question the documents that you do find, because many of these documents are incorrect, have incorrect information, and so I don't know if that answered your question, but in terms of methodology, oral history, interviews with people, there's, in the end, for some of these stories, there are certainly facts that we have found and have verified as facts. But we call this project a speculative research project or a speculative exhibition history. And I think for the story of the Palestinian exhibition, there are still many things to be found. We don't think that we will find them necessarily. Many will remain buried. But I don't think we're trying to find every single fact and answer, but it's rather to understand, to bring together the different stories and the different versions of history. So many art historians may have a problem with that, but we're totally fine with that. But I think we're, in a way, trying to provoke and put this material out there also to allow people to sort of ask questions about their own histories and their own sort of networks from that time.
A lot of what Kristine said also kind of stands true from where I'm coming from, but obviously none of this material has been shown in an exhibition format, so that part doesn't apply. But I think it's important to look at these exhibition histories for art history to kind of build a narrative that is, from where I'm coming from, I feel is missing from from the pedagogical perspective in Pakistan, and it's very, very important for a country that was only formed in 1947 to forget so fast or not have written records or have academic literature is problematic. A lot of the way history is passed down is oral history, like Kristine also said, but oral history through people within the art world, so it kind of becomes canon when somebody says, I worked with this artist, or I bought or I sold. It's either through, curator is a relatively new term for that, in that sense, but through the voices of the gallerists and the collectors. And I think it's important to just dig up and start working through them, just start plotting the points, and kind of take it from there to build that so that a narrative can be built.
But obviously, how you access these archives is not objective at all. It is in the interest of the researcher. In my case, it was subjective because I belonged to the family of Zubaydah Agha, and I grew up seeing these things around me, and it was only when I went to art school, I didn't even question it. My professor in my master's degree questioned it and said, well, why have you never pushed it? I'm like, well, there's no material. And she was like, well, go out and make material. And it was very subjective how I approached it.
Maybe just to add one thing, I think this project which began looking at the Arab world ended up becoming a transnational project, and I think that was something that we didn't anticipate, but I think is really important. It's like Ming and I have spoken about that, to broaden these sort of national art histories and break the national art history, because it's profoundly uninteresting at times to sort of think that way, but to think about a time where these borders were very different, connections were, these networks were built around ideologies, around causes that mattered to individuals, and to try to think about history or art history through that lens may do something completely different to the reading of the works, for example.
I think this might get to something that you were saying in our earlier session, Patrick, which is that we really have to think about how methodology shifts rather than just naming. And what I think this kind of work does, which is, to a traditional art historian, relatively sociological, or what it does is it disrupts the ways in which art history itself is constructed. That these sort of formal histories, as we all know, are, A, Eurocentric, B, rely upon a historiography that begins with, like, Winkelmann and Wolfson, and are part of this nation-building project, and also the building of national collections and ethnographic collections, right? And so because that is the way that the archive of knowledge and also the structures of our disciplines are founded, we kind of need to rely upon these alternative networks in order to disrupt how the histories themselves are actually written. So,
sorry,
yeah.
I just wanted to add something to that. Much of the issue is also with looking at where and when this is being written, when history is being written. The fact that Zubaydah Agha was a woman and a recluse, and she did not participate in a lot of the social activity, was also why a lot of the discourse isn't around that, primarily because she cut herself off. She was not a very sociable person in her end years, and a lot of the early history that you read from Pakistan are about people who were either part of the Lahore Art Circle or the Progressive Art Circle, or were talking about politics and poetry, but it was a very, very male-centric sort of group that was meeting late in the night. There was alcohol, there was all of these things where I think even though Agha was a very, very progressive woman, would not have found a place in.